friends, welcome to Tarunayas. Today we will be discussing editorials from the Hindu of 18th of November 2022. So the topic of the day is the opacity in the political financing. The title of the article is Opaque Political Financing Could Cost Democracy. You can relate it with your General Studies paper 2, Election Commission of India, which is the authority to look after the polls in India, the election processes, and Election Commission of India under Article 324 of the Indian Constitution is empowered to conduct free and fair election. All right, and the issue of today's article is the political funding. In the light of the electoral bond that had been issued by the government of India in the year 2017, and the political funding that parties receive overall. All right, so let's start with the article. This is the article which I have taken from the newspaper The Hindu of 18th of November 2022, and it has been written by a political researcher and a columnist. The title of the article is The Opaque Political Financing Could Cost Democracy Dear. Now, if I talk about the political party in India or the party system in India that India follows, there are certain key terms that you as an aspirant of civil services should know. The first key term is that India has a parliamentary democracy. All right, we do not have the direct democracy. That means we select, or better, more technically speaking, we elect our representatives to the Indian Parliament. So the second point that brings to us is that India is a representative democracy. That means we do have a parliament, and in that parliament sits our representatives. That means those people or those candidates fielded by the political party in the election whom we choose as our representatives. All right, so India has a representative democracy. This is the second point. The third point that we must know is that India, apart from being a parliamentary representative democracy, the election process that we follow to elect our candidates is first past the post system. Okay, FPTP system. That means the candidate who secures the majority of the votes in a constituency wins the election. So we have first past the post system. All right, so we do not have the proportional representative system as it is followed in many countries across the world. Especially if we take the example of the Israel, then Israel has a hybrid system. So we are not going to go into the details of the hybrid party system or the hybrid system of electioneering, etc. But we are restricting ourselves to that what is the meaning of the first past and the post system that India follows, in which the candidate who secures the majority of the votes, valid votes which are polled in an election process, is declared as the winning candidate. So these are the 3 points that we must remember. The fourth point is that Indian political parties are built on the we have a multi-party system. If we take the example of China has a totalitarian or an authoritarian regime. That means there is only one party which rules the country, and that is the Communist Party of China. If we take example of America, then America has a two-party system, the Republicans and the Democrats. Within those two parties, there are several factions. All right. So in Democrats, if you see, there will be several factions who would be having different ideology, but they all belong to one party, that is the Democrats. And similar is the case with the Republicans. However, there are only two parties in America, the Republicans and the Democrats. But if we consider the example of India, then India has a multi-party system, and the parties are formed on the basis of the ideology. So there are left parties, which are the communist parties, for example, the Communist Party of China, the Communist Party of India, which was formed in 1920s after the Tashkent Agreement, and then it continued. And we have got national parties such as we have the Congress, we have got Bharatiya Janata Party. So depending upon their inclination towards the ideologies, they can be described as the left wing party, the right wing party, for example the Bharatiya Janata Party, and the centrist party, which tries to project a balance between the left ideology and the right ideology. So that is the Congress party. However, apart from having and we also do have the Bahujan Samaj Party, which projects the ideology of the subaltern groups, right? So subaltern groups basically the candidates who have sociology as their option, they would be understanding what is the subaltern perspective or subaltern ideology. That means the ideology of the marginalized group, for example the Dalits in India. So their perspective is known as the subaltern group. So the party which represents the ideology or the views of the subaltern groups is the Bahujan Samaj Party. Then we have the Socialist Party also, for example the Janata Party, which won the election after the emergency in 1977 around. So we have got the Janata Party, we had the Samta Party, we had the Socialist Party of India. So we had the parties which had socialism as their main ideology. By socialism, we mean that the state is going to take care of the welfare of the people. So as it was described by our former Prime Minister Pandit Nehru, he said that India is a socialistic democracy. That India is a democracy. There is no complete rule of the state, but India is a socialist democracy. All right. So these are the key words that we have to remember, that India has a multi-party system which is based on the ideology. There is a right-wing party, there is left-wing party, and we do have the centrist party. However, apart from these national parties, there are regional parties also. So from 1970s and especially 1980s onwards, you would see the emergence of a new system, which is the regional party system. So these parties, they were not formed specifically on the basis of the left wing or centrist ideology. Rather, their formation was based on the local issue, the regional issue. So that is the reason why they are known more as the regional parties. For example, if I take the example of the IDMIC and the DMK party in the Tamil Nadu, and we have the Communist Party in Kerala, which has been ruling for a long time, and we do have the Telugu Desam party, we have got the party in Manipur, in Mizoram. So these regional parties, they try to project the regional issues, or they try to highlight the local issues that the state has faced. For example, we have a JMM, right? So Jharkhand Mukti Morcha. In fact, Jharkhand Mukti Morcha had played a very crucial role in the self-determination of the Jharkhand, when in the year 2001 Jharkhand was separated from the former state of Bihar. So this is how the Indian party system functions. But now when a political party fields its candidate, a political party campaigns, and when a political party works, so its functioning requires funding. So this is the main topic of our editorial, that from where the party gets their fund, and their transparent funding is of utmost importance, because the political party, they form the basis of our democracy, or you can say that they form the basis of our parliamentary and representative democracy. So where the party is receiving the fund is an important thing. The recent moves that the government of India has taken with respect to the political funding is, first, that it had amended the FCRA Act of the year, FCRA Act, and it formed the FCRA Act amendment of the year 2021. All right. So that was one point. Then it had also changed the CSR regulation, that is corporate social responsibility regulations, in which and it had also changed the fundings with respect to the political parties. So in the year 2017, the government of India had brought a scheme which is known as the Electoral Bond Scheme. So according to the government, Electoral Bond Scheme is going to increase or enhance the funding or transparency in the funding of the political parties. However, there are some experts who says that electoral bonds, rather than enhancing the transparency of the fundings, they have in fact increased the opacity in the funding process. They have largely they have kind of brought the cloud over the transparency, and they have sort of brought the opacity when it comes to the fundings which a political party receives. So these are the certain main points that the writer here in this editorial is highlighting. So one step by step we would move on, and we will consequently understand that what writer wants to say and what are the views of the writer, and also when the writer talks about the electoral bond, and what the main issue that the writer highlights. So the writer wants to say that the discourse of the political finance in India, it revolves around this issue of corruption, right? So when we see that this political contestation over the electoral bonds, it has two binary views, either they are good or they are bad. So there is only two binary views that are being presented. Either they are projected as a pious instrument for cleansing the politics by routing the funding through the legal channels, or they are projected as the murky mechanism that are going to institutionalize the corruption in the funding system of the political parties. So therefore, the corruption frames the locks of political funding into a superficial binary of clean versus dirty, that is expressed in moral or legal terms. So this is what the writer has to say, that there are only two views when it comes to the electoral bonds. Either they are projected as the dirty mechanism which are going to institutionalize the corruption, or they are projected as a clean mechanism which would enhance the transparency in the political funding. However, this framing, it precludes, that means it does not focus on the structural relationship between the nature of the political funding and the shape of our political system. So that this relationship implicates that almost every political party, which is whether it is a ruling or in the opposition. So corruption is mainly one symptom. So according to the writer, corruption is only one symptom of this whole structural relationship rather than the driving factor. So according to the writer, corruption is not the driving factor, but rather it is just one symptom of the structural relationship between the first, the nature of the political funding, the nature, and second is the shape of our political system. So this is what writer has to say. So these are the two things which are interlinked with each other. All right. And now these two things are not focused upon when we speak of the EB, that is electoral bond. All right. So the writer wants to talk about that how this interlinking or this relationship between the nature and the shape of the political system, it plays a pivotal role. So first reason that the writer wants to give, the writer says that in any country, the nature of the political finance, the nature, it is important as one of the determinants of the structure of the political competition. Right. So the structure of this political competition, it can be studied according to the writer around three axes. The first is the institutional axis. The first axis that writer says is the institutional axis. That means the institution which regulates the competition between the ruling faction and the opposition party or the opposition faction. Here, what is the institutional mechanism that we have? Right. So we are including the legal mechanism also in this institutional mechanism. So what is the institutional mechanism in India when we speak of regulation of this relationship, right? When we speak of the regulation of the political competition, the structure of the political competition. So according to Article 324, we have the Election Commission of India, whose mandate is to secure free and fair election. Now, free and fair election is not a simple word. Free and fair election represents that there is absolutely no influence on the voters when it comes to the campaigning, when it comes to participation in the electoral process, and they are free from every sort of influence, pressure or coercion, even if it is physical or it is psychological. Sometimes what happens, that the social deprivation, the economic deprivation, and the inequality that our country has, the elections are not free and fair. Physically they may be, but mentally they are not. People get influenced by the agenda of the political party, by the manifesto of the political parties. So therefore the political parties, they try to attract people towards their agenda by their election manifesto, right? So when we speak of this free and fair election, we mean that the voters are under no coercion or under no influence of any sort when it comes to the participation in the election process. That means the vote that they cast is completely on the basis of their free will, right? So this is what the free and fair election means. And physically also the election should be free and fair. That means there should be no muscle flexion, there should be no booth capturing, there should be no distribution of the freebies before the election and also near the polling booth, etc. So this is the physical process of free and fair election, and mental also and psychological factors also we discussed. So this is the institutional mechanism. The Article 324, it gives supreme power to the Election Commission of India, especially during the process of election, during the time of election and throughout the process of election. And the second mechanism is the Representation of the People's Act of 1951. Right. So this is a very powerful act which was legislated by the Parliament, because not everything is written in the Constitution. The Constitution, however, empowers the Parliament to legislate on a certain subject matter, and therefore Parliament, using its power, had legislated the Representation of the People's Act, which looks after the corruption in the election process and disqualification of the candidates, etc., etc. So let's not talk into detail the representation of Representation of People's Act of 1951, because it is a very big act and there are a lot of sections which have the mandate or which have the provision with respect to the corruption, with respect to the election malpractices, corrupt practices in the election, with respect to the disqualification of the candidates if they are convicted of a crime, etc., etc. So this is the first point that the writer has raised, that there is an institutional mechanism. The second point that the writer talks about is the organization. That means the regulation of the competition within a party. So if you look at the political party system in India, then we do not have the intra-party democracy. So here what the writer means by the organizational structure within the political party, he's pointing towards the intra-party democracy. How many times have we seen that the party worker who is working at the grassroots level rises to the level of the party president or to the bigger post in the party, etc., etc. There are, of course, instances where the political workers where the grassroots workers working for a particular political party have raised themselves to a certain level, to a supreme position within the structure within the organization of a political party. But those are very few instances where it has happened. However, largely if you see, then the workers at the grassroots level have a very low chance of rising them to a supreme position in the political party. So therefore, there is a lack of intra-party democracy. And in one of our editorial, we had discussed the intra-party democracy when the Congress had conducted its party president election, in which Mallikarjun Kharge had won the election against Shashi Tharoor. So that was one editorial we had discussed with respect to the intra-party democracy. You can watch that to understand it better. But we have discussed the institutional mechanism, we talked about the organizational structure. Now we talk about the ideological. So the roles of the idea, it is very important in determining the competition between the parties. Now if we look at, whenever a political party comes into the ruling without any political agenda, we speak of it in a fair manner, that a political party, when it comes in the power, it has an agenda which it wants to implement in the country, right? So therefore the ideology has a very important role to play in the competition, that which ideology is going to work and which ideology is going to lead a particular party to become a ruling party in the country. So these are the three things which the writer has talked about. So writer is talking about the electoral bond. Before we go into the depth of the editorial, we speak a little of the electoral bond here and how the scheme is worked out. Basically, electoral bonds are the bearer instruments in the nature of the promissory notes. That means the person promises to pay certain amount to a political party. It is an interest-free banking instrument. Only the citizens of India or the body Inc. Means incorporated in India is eligible to buy the electoral bonds. No foreign body is eligible to buy electoral bond. So all the fulfillment with respect to the KYC norms has to be done, and payment can be made through the bank account, etc., etc. They can be purchased in the multiples of rupees 1,000, 10,000, 1 lakh, 10 lakh, etc., etc. And they are available from the specified branches of the State Bank of India, and the period of purchase is available from the period of 10 days in the month of January, April, July and October, as may be specified by the Government of India. So in the month of October, that is the last month, so the electoral bonds could be purchased by the people who are interested in giving donation to the political party. Their shelf life is only 15 days. That means after 15 days they expire. They are no more eligible for the funding to the political party. They can be used to make donation to a political party which is registered. Now, in order to be eligible for the electoral bond scheme, a political party has to be a registered party. There are at times unregistered parties too. So a registered party is the one which is registered under the section 29A of the Representation of the People's Act of 1951. So here you can say the institutional mechanism that is regulating the political funding, right? So this is the institutional mechanism. We spoke of Article 324 also as an institutional mechanism. Organizational we covered, and ideology also we covered. Now let's move on. So this is the sample of electoral bond from SBI, that how it looks like. Now there are certain things which needs to be noted here. You can see this is only a sample bond. The name is not mentioned here, right? The name is not mentioned. That means the person who is buying the bond, or the body Inc. which is buying the bond, the name will not appear on the electoral bond. So the date of the issue is mentioned here. It will be valid, of course, up to 15 days from the date of issue, and the amount of the electoral bond is given. So this is how the electoral bond is issued to the people, or to the body Inc., etc. So it does not have a name. So this is to be noted, that it does not have a name. That means the point which the writer is going to raise further is the anonymity. That means anonymity. This anonymity, basically, it can either work as an instrument of transparency according to the government, and according to some experts who oppose electoral bond scheme, this anonymity is basically an instrument of opacity, because nobody knows from where the money is coming. The name is not mentioned here. We don't know from where the money is coming. However, the ruling party, according to some of the experts, the ruling party would know, because the transaction takes place from the bank account. So all three axes of the political competition we discussed, and we also saw that these political axes, they influence the nature of political finance, right? So we had institution, organization and ideology. All the mix of these three things would decide the finance to a party. All right, so this is what the writer has to say, that the degree of transparency of the political funding informs the efficacy of institutional safeguards. The how much transparent is the political funding, that would decide the efficacy of the institutional safeguards that India has against corruption in the political parties and its funding. For example, the writer has given the example that this electoral bond, it has inherent opacity, and it renders the power of ECI, that is Election Commission of India, irrelevant when it comes to having a level playing field. Because in one of the report, or you can say the data that was published in the Hindu of 17th of 17th of November 2022. So if you go and look at the 17th November edition of The Hindu, in Facts and Data, in title heading Facts and Data, you would find that how much electoral bond money has gone into which party, etc. So even the ADR report, even the report by the Association of the Democratic Reforms, which is an NGO working for the as a political analyst and political research NGO, they also pointed towards the fact that the ruling party had received a majority of the funding. All right. So when it comes to the electoral bonds, it does not provide the level playing field to all the parties, So also the writer points towards the information asymmetry between the ruling and the opposition parties that also affects the fairness of the electoral process. So now we have discussed the various factors which would be responsible for inducing or responsible for enhancing the transparency in this whole mechanism: institutional, organization, ideological, and the information, right? The second reason that the writer points towards is the extent to which the political funding is centralized within a party. That also determines whether the power in the party is drawn from the organization, or the power in the party is drawn from the personalistic manner. Now what does writer wants to point here is that, if in the global trend, if you would see, then there is a rise of personality cult. And what do I mean by it? See, a political party wins an election not on the basis of its election manifesto or its election agenda or the reform that it had projected to the citizens of a particular country. Recently, there has been a rising trend that a political party wins an election on the basis of one charismatic personality. So I am, without naming any person or any charismatic leader of any political party, trying to maintain the anonymity here, but you would understand is that in India, people do not vote to the person, right? People vote for the political party, which is represented by one person, right? So recently it has been seen that India, when the election happens in India, we vote for a particular political party, regardless of the candidate that the party has fielded or projected in a particular constituency. We do not generally know even the name of the person from that particular constituency. So in India, this is the misinformation that people have. So we directly go and vote for a particular party because that party is represented by one person. So this is what the writer wants to say, that there is a personalistic manner. So if the political funding which the party receive is not distributed, is not decentralized, or rather it is centralized, or it is exercised in a personalistic manner, then it also infuses a sort of opacity in this whole structure. So this is the second point that the writer has raised. For example, the writer has given example of certain political parties. You can read here. So if you would see that the funding that they receive is actually wields power in a responsive and programmatic manner, right? Now, the writer has given further example of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom over the course of the 20th century, from an organizationally driven mass party to a centralized elite party. So the writer wants to give example of this Labour Party in UK. This is not Indian party, but the writer has given example that how a party which was mass oriented, suddenly, it started to transit towards an elite oriented party. Right. So that was because the balance of the party funding, it shifted from the labor unions to the corporate houses, right? So therefore the nature of now I think this point that the writer wants to raise with respect to the nature of the political funding would be clear to you. So the nature of the political funding would also decide the competition amongst the political parties. So Labour Party, when it received the political funding from the labor unions, it was a mass oriented party. But when it started to receive political funding from the big corporate houses, it then became a elite oriented party, right? So the Labour Party example has been given by the writer. Writer has also given the membership funded parties, such as membership funded party means the members of the party gives funding to the political party. So this Dravida, Munnetra, Khazagam and the Bahujan Samaj parties of an earlier era, they were highly organized party, but slowly they started to decline, and the reason was the nature of the political funding. The more the parties wield supreme power, the more, I mean, there is a change in the nature of the political funding. All right, so let's come to the third reason now. The third reason that the writer points towards is the political financial regime also shapes the role of ideas in grounding the political competition. So this relationship, according to the writer, can proceed in varied ways according to contingency of different political contexts. But as a general matter, writer says that this political finance is anchored in a narrow concentration of economic capital. The ideological basis of the political competition tends to become severely corroded. Now, the third reason that writer points towards, if I summarize these lines by the writer, then this finance, the political finance, basically has now become an economic capital for the political parties. It is no more based in the ideology of the party. It is no more the ideology of the party, rather the economic capital that drives the political finance. So therefore, according to the writer, it is narrowly anchored in this, right? Now the writer points towards that how these electoral bonds, they act as an advantage to the ruling party. The first thing that the writer points towards is their framework, right? So for example, if you look at the electoral bond that I had discussed, so there is no name, and so basically, according to the writer, they are opaque instrument, and Supreme Court still is yet to have hearing with respect to the electoral bond. So this was about the electoral bond. Now, according to the writer points towards this fact that how do we expect the rise of electoral bond as a major source of political finance to affect the prevailing patterns of the political competition. Now here I would like you all to refer to the second ARC, that is Administrative Reform Commission that was established in the year 2005. So second ARC had recommended the public finances. In fact, there were several committees that were established or that were formed with respect to the electoral funding, and the first committee that I would mention here is the Dinesh Goswami Committee on the Electoral Reforms that were established in the year 1990. It had recommended a limited support. And limited support means, for example, the vehicle, the fuel, the higher charges of the microphone, the copies of the electoral rolls, etc., etc. It also recommended a ban on the company donation. Now what happens? Many of the companies, they donate to political parties. So according to Dinesh Goswami Committee, it recommended ban on this corporate funding. Why this was the case so? Because of the private lobbying. Now in India, if you consider private lobbying, it is not, there is no publicly there is no private lobbying. Of course, we do have the big corporate houses. For example, we have CII, we have IFCO, we have got other like NASCOM, etc. We have got ASSOCHAM, which represents the views of the companies and etc. But still, this private funding from the corporate houses also changes the policies by the government in their favor. So there is indirectly lobby by the private corporate houses in their favor to make policies in their favor. So this is the reason why the Dinesh Goswami Committee of 1990 had recommended a ban on the corporate funding, or the company donations. The second committee, which also recommended a partial state funding, mainly in the kind of the certain essential items, was the Indrajit Gupta Committee on State Funding of Election. So, if in the GS General Studies paper 2 in your mains question, a question is asked on the basis of the transparency in the election funding, etc., etc., you should mention these two committee, the Indrajit Gupta Committee and Dinesh Goswami Committee. This would give you an edge over other candidates. And second ARC had also recommended the partial state funding. All right. So these are the cases. Now, if you look at the other countries, then there is certain minimalist pattern of funding which is seen by the state in the country of UK, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. These are the certain countries which provide minimal state funding to the political parties, and the public funding are not merely for the election, but they are also given for other party activities. For example, Sweden and Germany. So there is some mixed pattern. That means the partial reimbursement for the political funding. It is given in France, Netherlands, and South Korea. So these are the name of certain countries which you remember, and the type of the funding that they receive. There is a complete funding by the state in Germany and Sweden. There is minimalistic pattern which is seen in UK, etc., and there is a partial funding which is seen in France, right? So these are some international cases which you can quote in your answer to fetch good marks and have an edge over the other candidates. So this is what the writer has to say. Writer has given example from the ADR which I had already mentioned, that 52% of the total income was through the electoral bonds was given to the national parties, and 53% of the total income of the regional parties, they came from this electoral bonds. So there are two salient features of the electoral bonds we must consider to gauge its impact on political competition. One is design of the electoral bonds. Electoral bonds we already discussed. It gives advantage to the ruling party. This is one point which the writer raises. The second point, according to the Election Commission of India data, so if you look at that, how much the ruling party had got funding from electoral bond, which was even above 75%, and there was 9% share to the other political parties. So you can look at it here. As a political scientist, the Milan Vaishnava has written that these electoral bonds, they invert the concept of transparency and openness in political funding, whereby only the government and presumably the ruling party have access to the transaction trails. This information asymmetry and barriers to the institutional scrutiny, it has considerably skewed the channel of electoral bonds towards the ruling party. The second reason that the writer raises when it comes to having an advantage to the ruling party is that these electoral bonds, they centralize the political funding towards the national units of the political parties, and the state and the local units are not given leverage. The writer has given data from the RTI reply that out of rupees 5,000, approximately out of rupees 5,851 crore of the electoral bonds sold in the year 2018-19, 80% of the bonds, they were redeemed in Delhi. So this is the argument of the writer, and the argument is substantiated by this data from the RTI, that how the state and local units of a party are not leveraged, and only the units in the metropolitan cities and national units are given edge over the other units. So not only the electoral bonds were introduced, but the writer has also pointed towards that how the erstwhile limit was also removed. See, a corporate house can only lend 7.5% of the net profits to the political funding. However, this was removed. This limit was removed. That means now the corporate house, they can unlimitedly give fund to a political party. So these changes in the legal architecture of the political finance enables the prospect of an alliance of the national political elite and big business conglomerates, which in a certain language is known as the crony capitalism. That means a sort of an alliance between party and the corporate house. Crony capitalism. So according to the writer, these two features of the electoral bond, they signal an important break, right? For example, the writer has given an historical example that how this is a book by Mr. Vaishnav and Devesh Kapoor for sociology students for your unit political political theory. You can use this example by a book by Mr. Vaishnav and Devesh Kapoor. In their book Cost of Democracy, Political Finance in India, they have given this example that how Mrs. Indira Gandhi, our former Prime Minister, had banned the corporate donation in the year 1969 in order to limit the growth of the Swatantra Party, the Jana Sangha, and whom she had, according to the writer, this is not my view, whom she feared that they would increasingly attract more corporate backers, etc. So this is what the writer wants to say, that the structural changes or the structural reforms which are introduced time and again, it rather than increasing the transparency have led to more opacity in this whole structural of the funding to the political party. So therefore the writer wants to say that these changes according to the ruling party, they basically have tightened the grip, of the state over the big business through the project of dialing up the license control, nationalization of the key industries, etc., etc. Basically, according to the writer, this political funding, it is part of the wider strategy. So writer has again given the example that that how this personalistic relationship with the big business elites in order to marginalize the regional strongmen and then control the organizational structure of the Congress party during the prime ministership of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. So therefore writer has pointed towards the centralization of the political power through funding. All right, so again many examples have been given by the writer. These are not very important ones, so I would skip these examples. The important examples I have already discussed, and also I have discussed the main points with respect to the electoral funding. I did mention the second ARC, the Dinesh Goswami committee, the Indrajit Gupta committee, and we did discuss the electoral bond scheme. We also discussed the nature of the party system in India and how the whole functioning plays out. We also discussed that the three axes that writer wants to point towards, the institutional, organization and the ideological, that describes the whole scenario of the political funding in India. So this is what if I am to summarize this article or the views of the writer, then he seems not to be completely in the favor of electoral bond, but also he has described many other factors which acts as a determinant when it comes to describing the competition between the two political parties and the nature of the political funding, which would further describe the shape of the whole political system of the country, etc., etc. So of course the writer points towards the reform which are needed, and the reform at the level of the organization within the party system. That means the writer talks about the intra-party democracy and the institutional mechanism that would enhance the transparency. And of course the ideological mechanism is something that which would be least affected, but of course it does describe that how a political party receives its funding. So I hope you have understood this topic well, and if a question is asked in your mains examination, you would be better able to answer it and give better arguments and accentuate the same with data, etc., which were given in this editorial. So if you want to download the PDF, if you want to get the PDF of this lecture, then you can go to the Telegram channel. Thank you so much for watching Tarun IAS. Have a nice day.